Alrighty, this is a direct continuation, and so the last one is going to be necessary here. I'm talking about the prescription, essentially. Like if we recognize the split between opposites in the form of the meta crisis or meaning crisis, or in terms of Christian mythology, however else you want to frame it, the split between self and world is a pretty good way of looking at it. How can we apply Jungian insights to the group practice prescription? So when we understand that there's some kind of creative process involving natural emergence from groups that is designed to allow for the emergence of creative solutions to the split, to the sense of unity, to the sense of deeper connection, binding to the world. Well, once we recognize that, how can Jung support us here? And the answer has to do with, well, it's pretty arcane actually, so I'm not quite sure how to put it in a nutshell. But the idea is that I'm gonna keep looking at the insights that came from episode 4. I'm in the second hour of it at the moment, and talk about like when we recognize the split between opposites, for example, in group process or in our own life, what do we do from there? And the answer is in some way to take the third, to take the recognizing faculty that is our freedom, our inner spaciousness, the place from which we witness this conflict between opposites. Where do we direct that? Where do we point our attention? Where do we devote our energy and time? And Jung is sort of saying that it's by pointing ourselves back to the unconscious, by allowing for this natural creative process that involves symbols, that we can um, give rise to the solution that we're looking for. So, what does he mean by that? Let me try to bridge back into this. Yeah, so Jung feels that it's by pointing our will, by pointing our agency toward the unconscious, he feels that when we do that, that we find these sort of latent symbols. So there's a way that I think the way that I want to express this is that if we imagine this lattice work, this mycelial web of relationships that we have with objects, with people, with the world around us, it's an unconscious mycelial network, and we're not aware of it because it's within the unconscious, sort of by definition. And Jung's idea is that by bringing our attention back toward the unconscious, by facilitating these creative processes from the point of view with the attitude of spontaneity and childlikeness, that we can allow this web of relationality to manifest itself, to come into consciousness in the form of symbols. So he feels that when we point our will toward these latent unconscious symbols, that this is a way to evoke and elicit their function of mediating between opposites. So he feels that this symbol is in this unique position of being able to mediate between these different pairs of opposites, and that by bringing these symbols up into our awareness, so that the symbol comes up into our awareness and we go back down into our depths to facilitate that process. He feels that that's the right way to respond to the split condition. And so it's a suggestion to appeal to what Jung calls the self. And he starts talking about this. It's basically a center within consciousness that contains conscious and unconscious elements. It's kind of like the sun around which the ego orbits, like the earth. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I have summarized it in other places, what he means by the self. It's not that important here. I want to keep talking about symbols at the moment. So for Jung, only symbols attain this mediating position of being able to reconcile the split between opposites, and they naturally arise from our unconscious depths. So for Jung, symbols, they unite the real and unreal, the sense of reality and the sense of unreality in all of our different faculties. So he feels that for Jung, sensation, feeling, intuition, and thinking, they all have a different sense of realness and of what is unreal. And he feels that only symbols are able to unite those senses of reality in one phenomena. And he feels that that's what makes symbols kind of edgy because they're literally at the edge. They appear at the borderline between conscious and unconscious. And they test all of the faculties, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, in whether they regard this symbol of which we speak, symbols, as real or unreal, because it's actually both. It's between all opposites. And that's quite an important point. It's like this is why it's this symbols that emerge from what Jung calls the self, the center of personality. It's actually in the middle of our, it comes directly from the heart or from the center of our being, but it appears to be at the edge. And it appears that way because it's from the point of view of consciousness. So the idea that our consciousness is itself one half or one side of a polarity, and that by going back to the borderline, back to the mirror where our conscious interfaces with the unconscious, these symbols arise from the depths and they feel that they're on the edge, but they're actually in the middle when we understand there is also an unconscious, let's say, half. Yeah, I'm going to try and keep moving here because I don't want this to be too long. So you're sort of saying that none of the existing faculties that we have, like thinking, sensation, intuition, or feeling, none of them are impartial. So he feels that the reason that the will is to be oriented, that our freedom is to be oriented back toward our childlike creativity, our unconscious process, is because each of those faculties that we have get caught up in the conflict between the opposites. We get very emotionally invested in one side or the other. Um, this is why he talks about trying to find a quite impartial basis for the will that can establish a kind of new form of unity. And he feels it's only the unconscious which is able to serve that role. And so I just want to mention there, like another way to talk about that conflict between opposites is that it's a certain story. So if we take again this, and then we see, yeah, I'm thinking particularly about this part of it here. So the idea would be that one, two, three, and four sort of correspond to propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory awareness in Viveki's terms. And if that's the case, then there's a way that the duality, the polarity, the split that I'm talking about, it's also what I mean by that in this context is that we get stuck in a certain story, that we get stuck in a certain persona or narrative identity, we get stuck in a certain way of perceiving, a way of relating to the world, and that we don't have this flexibility that comes from being able to take different perspectives on the story that we're inhabiting. And so this is a different way to talk about that same split condition. And this is why Jung can see that there is a value in allowing ourselves to take up the perspective of the soul. So for Jung, the soul or anima is kind of equivalent to the divine double in Charles Stang or sacred second self in Viveki or the daemonian in Socrates. It's this an imaginal figure or figures that each can afford different perspectives on the story that we're habitually embedded in. So this is a kind of, we can see the elaboration of parts work, IFS here, that by taking up the perspective of different parts, although you want to be careful doing that, that one can get this flexibility on the story that one is embodying, inhabiting in normal life. Okay, steering back to what Jung is talking about, he's talking about instead of just delving into the depths of the unconscious in a reckless way, can we allow ourselves to take up the perspective of the soul? And what I mean by that in this context is simply our uniqueness, that which is not collective about us, that which is most personal, that which is most ourselves in a certain way. People will relate to that word very differently. Like And there's maybe a way of conceiving of the soul there that's slightly different than the demonian or divine double. I don't need to get into that right now to simply say that there's value in taking different perspectives, and from out of those perspectives, facilitating the unconscious emergence of these symbols, of these creative processes. Jung feels that it's only by taking up or inhabiting the perspective of our soul that the self can really manifest in the world in the form of these symbols. So this is why Jung feels that there's this importance to inhabiting the perspective of the soul. There's a connection here between the soul and creativity. So we might consider the soul to be the perspective of that part of us that allows for creative process, right? That allows for that serious play, the childlikeness, the spontaneity. It's getting to that place that I think Jung would feel is akin to taking the soul's perspective, and it facilitates the unconscious and its self-expression. Yeah, and so there's another idea here, and this is that unless we choose here, unless we focus our attention, our awareness back in a certain direction, in the direction of allowing this natural emergent process to fulfill itself, that the symbols that are contained in the unconscious, they don't emerge of their own accord. So long as our conscious awareness is caught up in the split between the opposites, so long as we're focused on the problem, then we don't give the energy that is required for these unconscious symbols to arise from the depths. So this is why Jung feels that it's so important to focus our attention, focus our awareness and our energy toward this latent unconscious symbols and to help them emerge. It's because this comes from the recognition that we actually can't solve, we cannot reconcile this conflict from the ego. We have to allow for, facilitate the emergence of this unconscious creative symbols that for Jung, that is that which can resolve the tension or heal the conflict that we're beset with. Okay, so now he starts talking a little bit more about the self. And what does Jung mean? I've summarized that in other places. I think there's an episode called Bringing Jung Together or Gathering Jung Together, where the self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. So it's kind of center of consciousness. It's a center of both conscious and unconscious aspects of our being that we get images of from the unconscious in the form of mandalas. For Jung, Christ is a symbol of the self. And so I won't go on about it here, but essentially it's the self, which is this deeper center of our personality, of our being, that can give rise to these creative solutions to the problems that our ego can't solve. Because the ego is, by definition, that which is caught up in the conflict. And so he feels that the more that we become aware that our development is arrested by this conflict, the more we become aware that we can't solve this problem, we can't move forwards, the more we become aware of that, the more it becomes possible for the energy that we have to be, quote, introverted by the self. So the energy that we have at our disposal is taken in to the self. And that happens more, that process is facilitated when we choose to give our energy to this unconscious symbol, to these unconscious symbols, and allow for their emergence, which is capable of uniting the opposites. And for Jung, that can only come about when we differentiate the self from those opposites. So when we withdraw from the conflict. So it's quite paradoxical because when we're so aware of this tension, this polarity, this binary split, then we're caught up in it, right? But he's talking about this capacity to step back from the conflict and focus our energy within. And in order to do this, there's a way that we need to detach our energy from both sides. So there's a way of practicing intentionally in such a way that we can get enough of a perspective on that conflict so that yes, we feel torn apart by it, but we still have the agency, we still have the choice of focusing our will toward the unconscious and facilitating its emergence. So this is what Jung means by sort of detaching our energy from both sides of the conflict, focusing it toward the self, toward these unconscious symbols. Because it is that which is between and beneath all opposites, all polarities. And so the energy that we direct toward it, that we allow to, the energy that we use to allow these symbols to naturally emerge is by definition not caught up in the conflict between the opposites. And in order to achieve that, the energy has to be divested, taken out from all of the objects of all of the faculties. All its so sensation, thinking, intuition, and feeling, they all have different objects of attention, right? And it's only when the energy is withdrawn from all of those objects and taken within the self, which may not be within us, the ego. It's sort of between self and world, tricky to talk about. Yeah, so there's a further idea here that the unconscious, it actually has an agency of its own. So we were talking about our freedom, our willing power, but there's also the will that is the unconscious will. And it pushes energy toward the self that we've been speaking about under conditions of threat to life. So there's an idea that there is actually an unconscious response to the threat to life that shows up in this situation of quote self manifestation. And that can be deeply scary when it's not something that when it's a process that seems to happen to us rather than a process that we choose to focus toward the unconscious. It can simply express of its own accord in the right context. And in that kind of situation, we're called to give consent to that self-manifesting process, where the only sort of difference between the cathartic quality, the inspiring quality, the quality of releasing, the only difference between that and something that's a traumatic kind of possession is whether we allow it to unfold naturally. So if we can have that capacity to let go, to surrender at the right moment, then that might be a key asset. The self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. Okay, a few more things to say here. Jung feels that part of the significance of Christ in this context is that the personhood of Christ, his narrative identity, or like who he was as a person, that became identical with his symbolic significance or his selfhood. So there's a way, what do I mean by this? There's a way that when we have our, like I'm talking about this relationship between the ego and this, what Jung calls the self, and this kind of corresponds to our sort of narrative identity, our sort of public facing persona, and the deeper layer of like who we really are in a sense. This sort of corresponds with this alignment between Christ as a person and Christ as a symbol. And so this is why we could talk about terms like integration or integrity in this context. Sort of alignment, this quality of being in accord with oneself, comes about when we can get the ego to focus in the right way on the self center and to allow for its creative self-manifesting process. And in this context, that would be a way to be Christ-like in the sense of our personhood mapping perfectly or aligning perfectly with this deeper layer of our identity that is our symbolic significance or our selfhood. Yeah, and so I've talked about the what Jung calls the transcendent function in other places, but this is basically what we've been talking about the whole time here. So this way that Jung feels that the a being, or we could say human or life, it has this process of becoming aware of a certain conflict, that our development is halted, arrested by this awareness of duality, and that we then return to our inner depths. We fall back on our inner resources to give rise to a certain creative solution that might come in the form of an insight or a dream or an image or a symbol or a creative solution to a problem. And this cycling process is what Jung calls the transcendent function. It's this way of going back out into the world and solving problems and then encountering something that we can't solve and then returning to our own inner depths and allowing for a natural solution to emerge. That's what Jung feels is the transcendent function, really. And it combines these elements of consciousness and unconsciousness. It combines these elements of the will and the sort of unconscious forces or creative fantasy. And this is another way of languaging what I mean by three and four in this context. It's a way of being aware of this condition of opposites, right? But then taking a perspective on that conflict, and from out of that perspective, focusing back on our unconscious process of facilitating this unconscious creative emergence of fantasy, of symbol, of image as a solution to that problem. That's what is meant by one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. It's the solution arises from the fourth, and it creates a situation of unity again. Okay, a couple more bits and pieces here. Yeah, again, Jung feels that in recognition of this conflict between opposites, it's the creative fantasy which is crucial to elicit or evoke, because it's that creativity is the source of symbols, and it's only symbols which are able to reconcile these opposites. So the idea is that there is this depth of our awareness which we can perceive in symbolic terms that we can bring more that we can bring up into our awareness, and that by doing so we can understand or experience how a certain conflict that we're beset with can be resolved. Couple more points. He says that if we want to create something new in this way, that we have to give up something that has already existed. And so this is like it's the process of exchange of energy. We talked about this a little bit. You know, sort of saying that if we want to come up with something new, then we have to withdraw our energy from participating in this conflict between opposites enough that that energy can be devoted towards self and its creative processes. If we don't withdraw our energy in that way, then something new is not able to come to the fore. And so this is why Jung starts to talk about that this process involves a return to the state of indeterminacy or quote infinite determinability. So he's talking about creating an inner space of emptiness or passivity or unity. It's a receptive, willing attitude, because this is an attitude of stepping back away from the conflict between the opposites, withdrawing our energy, and then cultivating a certain kind of openness, a certain kind of receptivity, such that the unconscious process can manifest itself. And so there's a way that this empty, passive unity of the conscious will corresponds to the full active multiplicity of the unconscious, which arises through the aperture of consciousness. And so this gets us to a certain point where we can see that there's a couple of things that align here. One of them is this directing of the will toward the unconscious, right? One of them is humbling oneself into a receptive position, awareness of the irreconcilability of the conflict. Another one is the inhabiting of the perspective of the soul and the attaining of an indeterminable quality, a quality of emptiness or being like still water. All of those align. So the ego has to be sort of consciously emptied out of our conscious directing in order to facilitate for unconscious emergence. So the sort of masculine quality of the will or the ego identity, the ego strength is opened, it's humbled, it becomes receptive. And this is how the unconscious creative process is able to manifest. And that kind of withdrawal, it requires holding the tension between the opposites without getting too stuck in them. And that's a very, very, very difficult thing to do because the whole point of that tension between opposites is that it's um, tearing us apart. This is what the split condition means. This is the source of all this nihilism and so on, and chaos in the world, is that we can frame that in terms of a tension between opposites, which is constitutive of who we are. And so the idea here is that we have to be able to get enough of, like, we have to recognize that conflict clearly enough by our participation in it, but also be able to withdraw our energy from it. And that really requires this skill in perspective taking, which is why that becomes so important in Viveki's terms. It's because by practicing the skill of taking a perspective on the story that we've been inhabiting, on the duality that we've been participating in, by taking that perspective, then we can allow for inner spaciousness to emerge. And from out of that spaciousness, from out of that receptivity, creative processes can come into being. And that's what Jung means by the emergence of the self. It's through the what he would call the consenting of the soul that the self could emerge in that way. Yeah, and so that's how we can see that the inner spaciousness that we need is created by practicing perspective taking. We become through the opposites, and that involves this. In order to become through, it's not that we have to completely withdraw in a detached way, in a reflective way. It's that we're so aware of the conflict between the opposites that we hold that tension in our being at an existential level, but we've cultivated enough spaciousness that we can still allow a creative process to arise. So that's what I meant by this shamanic logic of die and become. We don't outgrow different pairs of opposites by detaching from them and only witnessing them. We transcend different pairs of opposites. We outgrow them by participating deeply in them and then allowing for the creative processes to emerge from a place of inner spaciousness. And this is why we can clearly see here, this is why we require intentional practice. It's because it's difficult to do that. Okay, last couple of points, and then I'm going to pause this. Yeah, we can see here, this is why the ego has to recognize its inability to solve the conflict of opposites, which feels very painful. If we really feel that actually this conflict is tearing us apart, it's horrible, it's awful. And as a result of that recognition, we have to attain an inner state of receptivity in order to allow for the unconscious to create a symbol, create an image that's designed to resolve that tension. And that's why it feels paradoxical here, is because there seems to be a tension between recognizing the insolubility of the problem, which is painful, recognizing that we can't solve the problem, and attaining a state of inner spaciousness or emptiness. And that feels like a paradox, because if we're so caught up in this conflict, how can we really be receptive? How can we really be spacious? And those two are resolved both through intentional practice, so skill with perspective taking, skill in witnessing what's going on, but not being reduced to it or too sucked into it. But it's also resolved in the idea of letting go or surrendering to the process. So if we recognize this conflict, we can both deeply participate in that conflict, but also surrender or let go in a certain way that can allow a creative process to manifest itself. So the unconscious is caught up in this conflict between opposites, but that being caught up doesn't prevent a natural creative process from emerging if we allow it by surrendering to the process and letting go. And that allows the unconscious to bring forth a creative symbol designed to resolve the conflict. Yep, Jung just elaborates that our faculties, thinking, sensation, intuition, and feeling, they are themselves caught up in the conflict between opposites, but they have to disidentify from those opposites in order for the will to surrender to the creative unconscious. So there's a way that, again, it's a paradox. We're both caught in this deep tension, this deep conflict, but also needing to withdraw our energy, withdraw our involvement by letting go, by surrendering to inner creativity. Yeah, just thinking more won't get us there, which I'm slowly coming to the realization of that because it doesn't adequately disidentify from the thinking faculty. We need to get back deeper within our own being to the level of depth that is adequate to allow for creative solutions to arise in symbolic form. Yeah, and so when our energy is withdrawn or introverted into the self, into the center of personality, to me, that doesn't imply that the need for introverted involvement with the unconscious, but instead it implies the need for unconscious creative activity. So the self is sort of waiting to be tapped into. We need to allow for the extroverted creative expression of the self. We don't need to get too neurotic by delving deeply into the unconscious and sort of just getting stuck there. But it's about allowing or facilitating the emergence of a natural creative process. So that was the second hour from, yeah, the fourth episode in this series. And again, this is kind of review. I'm sort of trying to tie together some of the main Jungian insights into how to do this group process thing in a way which leverages the creative power of the unconscious. And I'm going to continue with the third hour shortly.